Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus warned us that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. Does the world hate us? Well, I got to admit that since the inauguration, it seems like somewhat of a weight has been lifted off the nation. We are now securing our borders so sex trafficking and drug runners and sex traffickers and terrorists can't come across. We're deporting the most violent people out there. MS-13 gang members, we're deporting them now. We are now officially, as a government, saying there are only two sexes, male and female, and we're dispensing with government diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. It really seems like, wow, the country seems to be at least turning back to a more common sense, we might say even biblical approach. Is that really true? And is the culture now not going to hate you because you're a Christian? Well, I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but while these are positive developments, I think we have to be aware that the culture still is not going to like Christians. What can you do about it? Well, my friend, the great Natasha Crain, has written a brand new book. She's been working on it for over a year. Here's the title: When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Persevering. I can't even read. Persevering for the common good as Christians in a hostile public square. And I was privileged enough to write the foreword. This book is not only eye-opening, ladies and gentlemen, it is extremely practical. At the end of every chapter, not only is there a summary, but there are specific things that you can do to love your neighbor as a Christian, as a salt and light Christian, even when your neighbor hates you. And there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done in our communities in order to bring us back to some level of sanity, to disciple one another, and to be salt and light in our culture. And this book by Natasha Crain will be a primary way that you can get information that will help you do it. So here she is, ladies and gentlemen. The great Natasha Crain, all the way from Smoky, California. Natasha, first of all, how close are the fires to you?
I'm a couple of hours south of the fires. So fortunately, we're not in any kind of immediate threat, but we see the smoke. We definitely see some of the ramifications of it and know people who have been in the middle of it. So it's a very, very terrible situation, obviously. And we pray for the continued safety of the firefighters and that it would all be contained.
Wait, Natasha, in California traffic, 2 hours is like 10 miles. So
yeah, a little further than that. Okay. A little further. I'm down in Orange County, so all right, a little bit
you're
south.
Okay right now. And this book, I know you've been working on it for quite a while. It's sort of a sequel to Faithfully Different, which, friends, if you haven't read Faithfully Different, you definitely need to. But you really wanted to make a difference in our culture. And as I write in the foreword, that this is not a political book per se. It's not a book primarily about politics, I write. It's much broader than that. This is a book about discipleship. It shows that we Christians ought to be ambassadors for Christ in every area of our lives, not just at church, but at home, at work, at play, online, in our local communities, and in our country. So why did you decide to write this, Natasha?
Well, over the last few years, I've just noticed increasingly that when I talk with Christians, whether it's out at conferences or speaking events or online, wherever it is, whenever I talk with Christians, people have this increasing sense that the culture is becoming a lot more hostile toward Christians and toward Christianity. People are being cut off by family members. They're being cut off by their friends. They're losing jobs. They're having trouble getting jobs because in some cases you have to agree to certain ideologies and in order to even be hired. And so there was this increasing sense that the world was opposed to Christianity. And at the same time, I was hearing a lot of people say, I don't want to speak up too much about things. I know we're supposed to speak truth, but there are so many complications of that today. And I don't want to offend people. And so what was happening is that people sense the hostility and then they take a step back and say, I don't want to stick my neck out because of it. So When Culture Hates You is kind of a book that bridges those two themes and explains why the culture hates Christians from a biblical perspective. Why does the culture hate us? Because when you understand that, then you're in a better position to respond. But then once you do understand the hostility, how do we persevere in spite of the hostility for the common good? Out of our love for God and our love for others, we need to be out there advocating for righteousness in society, whether culture hates us or not. So I wanted to write this book to equip and encourage the church to keep going, even though it's going to get harder and harder.
This is very important that, ladies and gentlemen, Natasha's pointing out that as Christians, we're here to make disciples, not just believers. Jesus didn't say make believers. He said make disciples. Those are people that are engaged in every area of life, following Jesus everywhere, and doing it in a way that is effective. And this book, When Culture Hates You, will help you to be effective. Because I say it's very practical. It's not only well-reasoned, well-argued, well-written, but when you go to the end of each chapter, Natasha has all these real practical things you can do in order to love people in the culture, even when they hate you. You're here to do what's right and leave the results to God. And in fact, the first chapter, Natasha, you point out that Jesus said it would happen. What does that mean?
Yeah. So a lot of people would say, like you said at the beginning of the show, well, it seems like things are kind of turning around. Does culture really hate us? Well, we have to go back to scripture to see what Jesus said about why the world would hate us, because this is very telling. So Jesus said, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. So this is really significant because we don't have to guess why Jesus was saying, hey, the world's going to hate my followers. He actually tells us it's because you are not of the world. So what does it mean to be of the world? In scripture, to be of the world means that you're under the governing rule of Satan. And like I say in the book, that's not a hyperbolic theological claim. It's very clear. It's directly stated that there are those who are of the world. You're going your own way. You're following your own desires. You're under the rule of Satan, quite literally. And then there are the children of God. And those who are of the world will necessarily hate the children of God because the children of God practice righteousness. And so that's the connection. Anytime you are shining light on the works of evil in the world, anytime you're doing that, the world is going to hate you for it. And so we have to understand that's why culture hates us. So even when there is a shift, like you're saying with the election, and there are starting to be some things that happen to now align better with what Christians believe. That doesn't mean that culture is now saying, wow, Christians really got this right. In a very pragmatic sense, some of these things have come about because some in culture have just said, well, it makes sense that we shouldn't have biological men playing women's sports. It's not because they've gone back to the Bible and said, we need to root our view of gender in how God has designed people. It's not that. And so we're going to see the cultural direction float back and forth continually, but the culture will ultimately hate Christians for practicing righteousness, for advocating for righteousness, which we will continue to do on many other issues that don't happen to be the ones that are in vogue today.
I happen to be reading through Matthew right now, and when, of course, I got to the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, it says this is verse 11, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." You are going to be insulted, as Jesus said here, but you're blessed for that, because you're going to be rewarded in heaven. And then he goes on to say you ought to be salt and light. And let me tell you, friends, this book, When Culture Hates You, is a very practical way to help you be salt and light. You might not know how to do it. Natasha Crain will give you very practical ways of doing it. So go get When Culture Hates You. And we're going to talk a lot more with Natasha in this program. Don't go anywhere. We're back in just 2 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you do when culture hates you? Well, you get Natasha Crain's new book called When Culture Hates You, because it's going to walk you through some of the more difficult topics that the culture will oppose Christians on, and gives you rational answers and even questions to ask, and more importantly, things you can actually do to be salt and light in this culture, because you are a disciple of Jesus and you want to follow him, and you want to love your neighbor by making sure that they are not harmed by bad policies or bad politicians or bad standards or bad reasoning. You're the one that has been tasked as a follower of Christ to be salt and light in this culture, and Natasha Crain will help you do that. Now, I noticed, Natasha, you just put a blog post a couple of days ago up on your website, and it has to do with the fact that there's a new vibe out there. Ever since the inauguration, the title of it is What the Inauguration and the Vibe Shift Means for Christians. And you've kind of agreed with what we've said earlier, that there does appear to be a bit of a vibe shift. But you also point out that maybe one of the reasons for the vibe shift is more pragmatic than there's a new standard that the culture is looking at, like it's the Bible or natural law. Why is that a problem, that the culture doesn't really have an external objective standard?
Well, if the culture doesn't have an objective standard, it's going to continually float back and forth in terms of what is culturally acceptable, what is considered to be morally okay or not. And so there will be times when, like right now, the culture, and I use this language very specifically, happens to align with biblical values on certain things. So I think that all of us were very happy that President Trump came out and declared that, there are two sexes, there's male and female, and Christians, of course, are going to celebrate that, because if that is going to be the policy and the ongoing philosophy of the administration, that's going to have all kinds of implications in culture for the common good. And that's what I'm talking about in my book, When Culture Hates You, is what do we need to support in order to advocate for the actual good of society as defined by God alone. So when something happens like this, a vibe shift, as people are calling it, we should absolutely celebrate. We should absolutely say this is wonderful, because it does align with God's truth of design for gender. However, that's only one issue. And there are plenty of other issues that the culture is taking issue with us on, for example, on the issue of abortion, just to name one. But even when you have something that happens to align with biblical truth at a given time, like the question of gender in this case, even when that's true, it's not going to last, because one ungodly ideology will ultimately be followed by another. We had critical theory that's still deeply embedded in our society. In the future, things are going to change again, most likely, with the question about gender. I mean, I gave the example in the article of saying 20 years ago, you might have had the president saying, well, it's just common sense, as Trump was saying in some of these issues, it's just common sense that marriage is between a man and a woman. And the vibe at the time would have been like, yes, that's marriage. Well, we don't see that as something that Trump is even tackling today. And so we see him tackling gender, but not sexuality per se. This is always going to change. When culture is not anchored to something objective in the way that morality should be anchored, then it's always going to change. It's always going to fluctuate. So celebrate the victories that happen to align with biblical truth at any given time, but know that those are always going to change because they're not anchored to something objective. In
fact, you brilliantly point out in the book, Faithfully Different, which I repeated in the foreword of this new book, When Culture Hates You, that the way most in the culture make decisions, at least non-Christians and tragically even some Christians, they make decisions based on feelings. In fact, can you briefly go over those 4 truths that you mentioned in Faithfully Different? And I repeated in the foreword to When Culture Hates You, because I think they're very profound, and it helps us understand why people decide what they decide about issues in the public square. Can you go through those 4 briefly, Natasha?
Well, I call them the 4 tenets of secularism. So in a culture that's defined by the authority of the self, what are your guiding principles? And so I say that number 1, feelings are your ultimate guide. Number 2, happiness is the ultimate goal. 3, judging is the ultimate sin. And 4, God is the ultimate guess, Guess, not guest. And in what I mean by that is that God is considered to be just something that, okay, you can believe this, but we don't have any confident basis for actually knowing anything about him. And so when you have those 4 tenets of the authority of the self, those are the ways that you're going to make decisions. And so what we see in terms of, as it applies to the common good, what we see is that people start thinking about, well, what's good for society? I'm going to go off of how I feel about those things, right? If I don't like it when I see these videos of biological men and women's sports, if I don't like it when I see women actually getting physically harmed by this, I feel like something's wrong. I don't like how that seems. When somebody says that, they may then advocate for a gender definition according to biological sex, but that's not rooted in any kind of understanding that, okay, God is the creator, he's the authority, he's the one who has created us with a certain design for our flourishing. They're not thinking in those same terms. They might come to the same conclusion that we do as Christians about the nature of gender and biological sex, but they're using a completely different rationale to get there. And so that's why it's so important that Christians are speaking truth in culture and rooting it in the Bible and explaining why it has a root in God himself and not just in, well, this is how I feel at a given time because this is what I'm seeing out there. Praise the Lord that people start to see these things from a purely pragmatic sense because it can start to open their eyes, but we have to go a step further and link it to God's truth. So I spent a lot of time on that in When Culture Hates You, is just explaining to Christians, here's how we should understand the definition of the common good. It can't be according to those things. It can't be according to our feelings and our happiness. It's got to be according to God's objective standards.
And you have a whole chapter on when culture hates you about that, the fact that God is the standard. He is the common good. He defines what the common good is, not our feelings, not our pursuit of happiness, although that's in our Declaration of Independence. I think when Jefferson said that, that was kind of such a general statement. The pursuit of happiness. Well, okay, we get that, but not at the expense of truth or righteousness, because you can be happy mowing people down, right? That's not what it means. But that's in our Declaration of Independence. It's not understood. Then you talk about in chapter 3, Natasha, of When Culture Hates You, when the common good is political. Advocating for the common good out of love for others sometimes includes the political. Why do you say that?
Well, if we take a step back, because a lot of people say, oh, the political, now we have the dreaded P word, but take a step back to just define what that means. And as I define it in the book, politics is just the way that people living in communities make decisions about how they're going to live together. It's really that straightforward once you take away all the baggage from the term that a lot of people use with it. And so if we're talking about how we live together in a society, it should be pretty straightforward that we understand that sometimes when we're talking about the common good, what's good for groups of people is going to involve political decisions. It's going to involve how our government governs. And so in that chapter, I just take a step back for Christians who are kind of hesitant about all the political engagement and involvement and say, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about politics. And if we love God and we love others as Jesus commands us to, part of how we love others is caring about the quality of their lives in the context of the societies in which they live. Of course, we should want to advocate for them in a political sense. We just have to understand what that means.
And even our ability to preach and live the gospel is partially determined by the laws that are made in Washington, our states, and our localities. So politics is important. It's not our first duty, but it gives us the ability to do our first duty, and that is to worship God and make disciples. If the government comes out, as so many governments do, against Christians practicing their faith, then it makes it much more difficult to carry out the Great Commission. So politics are important, and we're supposed to love our neighbors. And if you're not salt and light out there, are you allowing bad laws to be put into place that hurt your neighbor? How's that loving your neighbor? You're not. So you have to be engaged. Now, what are some practical things that can be done? Well, you got to get the book, ladies and gentlemen, because Natasha has them. Again, at the end of every chapter, very practical steps you can take. Just get the book, When Culture Hates You. Now, you're not going to be able to get this book until February 4th. You can advance order it if you want, but we have some copies at crossexamine.org. So if you want to get one sooner than February 4th, go to crossexamine.org, click on store, and we'll send you one. Again, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. In fact, Natasha, I wonder, now that the administration has changed and the vibe of the culture has changed at least somewhat, I wonder if Christians are going to be challenged more, and a book like this might even be more important. Like, for example, Christian nationalism is going to come up more and more. You Christian nationalists, you have a whole chapter on that. And this is a complicated topic. We're not going to tie it up in a neat bow on this radio program because there's a whole chapter you need to read on it. But what might you say to somebody who claims, well, you're just a Christian nationalist, Natasha? What would you say back?
Well, that's exactly what we're hearing a lot already post-inauguration is to claims about Christian nationalism and how that's going to take over America. If somebody said that to me, I would say, what do you mean by Christian nationalist? That anytime this subject comes up, that's what you have to ask someone, because everyone's using this term in a different way and you have no idea what they mean by it when they're saying that. Here's the thing. Most of the time, and I make this case in the chapter, and like you said, we don't have the time to unpack it all. I look at all the research studies and I surveyed hundreds of pieces of content where the media is using this terminology. The vast majority of the time when people are talking about so-called Christian nationalism, all they are talking about is that Christians are advocating for moral positions on policies out of a biblical worldview. Now, they're not using that terminology. They're basically just saying, hey, these Christians want to impose their morality on other people. And that's their view of it, because they think, and the words that they use will be things like, it is theocratic, it is anti-democratic, it is extreme, and it's pervasive. You can see these kinds of words that they use to describe Christian nationalism. And then when you go on to read the article to see, well, wow, this sounds really crazy and dangerous and threatening. When you look at the examples that they're giving, it will be something about how Christians are really working hard to implement pro-life policies, or that Christians are quote unquote anti-trans because we don't support things like puberty blockers and the ability for teenagers to get gender transitions. And so when you start looking at the actual examples and the pieces of content where they are concerned about Christian nationalism, you see that what they're concerned about is that we're bringing our values to bear in the public square. But as you've said many times, Frank, and I talk about in the book, that's just the nature of public policy. In every public policy, someone is imposing their morality on someone else. So as Christians, we have every right as citizens of this country to do so as much as anybody else.
Wow, but isn't that a violation of the separation of church and state? And are we really theocrats for trying to put forth a biblical worldview into law? Well, we'll address those objections and many more right after the break. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, on the American Family Radio Network, 182 stations around the country. We have the great Natasha Crain on the program, When Culture Hates You. Brand new book. We have a limited number of copies at crossexamine.org. Go to crossexamine.org, click on online, or click on store. You'll see it there. You can also pre-order it on Amazon, and we'll see you back here in 2 minutes, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I want to mention I'll be down in Sarasota, Florida, February 1st and 2nd, speaking at Grace Community Church. That's where we're going to have CIA this year, as a matter of fact, down in Sarasota. My friend, Dr. Chip Bennett, who we've done 5 podcasts with. I'll be down there speaking at the Saturday night service, Sunday morning services. That's February 1st and 2nd. And then looking forward a little bit, University of Nebraska, February 12th in Lincoln, Nebraska. That's appropriate. That's Lincoln's birthday. We'll be in Lincoln, Nebraska doing I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's open to everyone. Check that out. Then the following week, we'll be at William and Mary University. That's near Williamsburg, as you know, Williamsburg, Virginia. That's the 20th of February. And then I'll be at an Empower Conference, the Southern Baptists of Texas Convention. That's the 24th and 25th of February. I'll also be at the NRB Conference right after that. I'll be at Revival Christian Fellowship in Menifee, California on February 23rd. That is a little bit east of where you live, Natasha, I think. It's out south of Chino Hill, south of Riverside. So I go from there to Dallas. All the details are on our website, crossexamined.org. Click on events. You'll see Frank Turek calendar. I hope to see any of you out there on the road. By the way, we have 10 colleges, 10 universities this spring. So keep an eye on our website for that. And Natasha, you, me, and Elisa are continuing the Unshaken Conference. We're going to be in Albuquerque at the great Skip Heitzig's church. I want to say that's April. And it's going to be a little different now. We've kind of changed it up. What are you doing in the Unshaken Conference this time? Are you doing When Culture Hates You?
That will be one of the talks in the morning, yes. And so we have a new theme. We've done 8 conferences already from Unshaken, but now this year we're starting a whole new theme about exposing the unfruitful works of darkness based on Ephesians 5:11. So we will be tackling a whole bunch of different topics that we are going to be exposing. How do we do that as Christians in this culture, which is very closely related to When Culture Hates You in the book that we've been talking about. But that's really the theme, is what do we do? How do we be light? I think that every Christian has heard from the Sermon on the Mount, yes, Jesus says, be salt and light. But what exactly does that mean? I'm not sure that a lot of Christians have given a lot of thought to what that actually looks like, especially in a culture like today. So that's what I'm hoping the book will bring forth, and then the Unshaken conferences as well.
Yeah, go to unshakenconference.com if you want to see the 4 places we'll be this year. Albuquerque's first in April. Then, unfortunately, we've got to make an arduous trip to Hawaii.
Even though the culture hates us, we're still going to Hawaii.
That's right. And then I think we're going to be in San Clemente, California, and I want to say Dallas. Are those the 4?
That's it.
Okay. All the details on the website. And if you want to have your church host an Unshaken Conference in 2026, go to the website. I think there's a way to contact Harvest House. They're the publisher of When Culture Hates You, and they spearhead this conference that Natasha, Elisa Childers, and myself do 4 times a year. And we're covering issues like we're talking about today. How do you really become a disciple in a culture that hates you? How can you do this in a way that is most effective? It's going to take some courage, and Natasha has a lot of courage, and this book will help. But let's go back to what we were talking about just before the break, Natasha, because we did bring up some objections that people will bring up. I like what you say when someone claims for you to be, or claims that you're a Christian nationalist. You pull a Greg Kokel on them and say, "What do you mean by Christian nationalism?" Right? Certainly, it's better than secular internationalism, which is what a lot of people want to impose. But how do you deal with the objection when they say, "What about the separation of church and state?" Natasha, what do you say?
Well, again, ask a question. Well, what do you think separation of church and state means? Because most of the time when someone is telling you that you are advocating for your values in a way that's opposed to the separation of church and state, they have a misunderstanding of what that actually means. The First Amendment of the Constitution says that you cannot have an established state church. It forbids there being a religion that is imposed. A religion, very specifically. We can't pay taxes to a state church like we've seen throughout history and other places, and the government cannot force you to practice a specific religion. But that has nothing to do with moral issues, because like we talked about before the break, any kind of public policy is going to be a matter of morality in some way. So someone is imposing their morality on someone else. If you have laws against pedophilia, you are imposing the morality that pedophilia is wrong against someone whose morality is that, well, it's actually just an orientation to be a pedophile, to have these kinds of desires. And so I don't think we should have laws against them. Even though most people today would still agree that pedophilia is wrong and we don't want that in society, it's just to show that you still have 2 sides of every issue. And so, yes, we all have the right to bring our morality to bear in the public square, whether that's religiously motivated or not. You know, if we were going to go to every single person and say, did you vote this way because you have religious beliefs? We would be psychologically profiling people all day long. It doesn't work like that. So when it comes to the so-called separation of church and state, a lot of people simply have a wrong understanding of what is allowed, what is not allowed. And when Christians advocate for our values in the public square, we're doing it exactly as the way our democracy was intended to function. This is how it's supposed to work.
Yep. All laws legislate morality. The only question is whose morality. And I don't want to legislate my morality. I don't want to legislate your morality. I want to legislate the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul said the Gentiles and the law written on their hearts. That's the natural law that is God's nature, that is an objective standard of goodness. And unfortunately, many of the people who oppose that standard try and oppose it, as Natasha said earlier, based on their feelings, based on their desires, based on their wants, rather than the truth. They don't really have a standard. They're just trying to impose their opinions on people. So Natasha does a wonderful job, ladies and gentlemen, in the book When Culture Hates You, unpacking that. I do want to ask you this, Natasha. Did you see any of the inauguration or post-inauguration prayer meeting where the leftist female bishop got up and started talking about LGBTQ and these people fear for their lives and all this? What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, I did see the video of that. And, it's interesting because the bishop, she was basically, she was encouraging President Trump to quote unquote have mercy on immigrants and on the LGBTQ community. And she was appealing to the dignity of people. And it's interesting because of the language that's used. I think that if we just hear those words about dignity and having mercy on people who are afraid, well, we think, well, okay, that sounds good because of course we believe in the dignity of all people. Everyone is made in the image of God. The problem comes in what you mean by having mercy on. And so what she stated is actually part of it is factually true, that there are people who are feeling afraid right now. And I think this is where we have to be kind of careful in how we address this. There are people feeling afraid. So for example, there are families who have transgender identifying kids who feel afraid, whether we think that they should feel afraid or not is another issue, but who do feel afraid that they're not going to have access to certain procedures and certain medicines in order to make what they see as a gender transition. They feel afraid of that. And that is in part what she's referring to. So I'm just giving this as one example. But she is saying in her, and I'm assuming this based on her positions, that she's saying we need to have mercy on people like that. I think what she means is we need to affirm what they want to do. I think what she means is that having mercy is to affirm that they have that they have a fear that's accurate and that we need to basically affirm that, because I think she ended at the very end. She said something about not wanting to harm people. But I talk a lot in the book about making sure we have the right definition of harm, because anytime we're talking about good, bad, right or wrong, harmful or helpful, we have to go back to an objective standard. So in this example that I'm giving about kids who might be feeling fearful about not having access to these procedures, they might feel that fear and they may think that's harmful. But as Christians, we have to know that it's actually harmful to give these kids those procedures. That's actually mutilating to their bodies because it's going against God's design for them. So even though the bishop is appealing to this language, even though she's appealing to language that we would agree with in terms of the dignity of people and wanting to have mercy on people and treating them as image bearers of God and not wanting to harm, I think that we have some very different definitions of harm that we would need to work through before saying, that we can agree with you on this. So it comes down to definitions and not just the appeal to broad language that people can use very differently.
Yeah, this might sound odd to some people who listen to this podcast. What I'm about to say, you might go, I didn't think Frank would have this take on it. I actually applaud her for standing up for what she believes about politics from the pulpit. Because I've been saying this, and I know you've been saying it, we've been saying it for years, that pastors, if they see an injustice, they need to stand up and talk about it. They need to get involved politically for a number of reasons. If we're going to love our neighbors, we want to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, that the right laws are put into place so people are not harmed. So I applaud her for that. What I don't applaud her for is the fact that she's ignoring the Bible when she says these things. As you pointed out, she seems to be saying that LGBTQ behavior is a good thing and we ought to advance it, when in fact it's completely anti-biblical. And as our mutual friend Megan Basham has pointed out in her book, Shepherds for Sale, the left has been pouring money into so-called Christian organizations and even some denominations to turn them politically to the left. And this is an example of that. I don't know if she specifically has been a recipient of any of these funds or that denomination necessarily has, but the Episcopals have been off the biblical rails for years. But this is the kind of rotten fruit you get when you ignore what the Bible says. You talk about biblical issues, but they're distorted in such a way that they're not applied properly. Yes, mercy is good. Yes, love is good, but love doesn't mean approval. And I think that's what she was trying to say, that love means we have to approve of what everyone wants to do. Well, why does she not approve of what President Trump wants to do then? If she's right about what President Trump wants to do, because she realizes that love doesn't mean approval on one hand, but yet on the other, she's contradicting herself.
And no one's calling her a Christian nationalist because she, quote unquote, mixed her faith in politics by being there and talking about politics within the church, which goes back to our prior discussion about how Christian nationalism is really just a euphemism for you're advocating for conservative, unpopular positions using your biblical worldview to do so.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Nobody ever is upset when the leftist preachers and progressive Christians get involved politically. That's what they're there to do. But as soon as someone who actually believes the Bible is true and applies it properly, as soon as that person, that Christian or that pastor or that priest or whatever tries to say something, you can't do that. That's separation of church and state. So look, if irony could kill, the people who say this would all be dead, okay? Because they're doing exactly what they say ought not be done. A lot more with Natasha Crain. Her fabulous brand new book, When Culture Hates You, comes out February 4th. If you want to get we have a limited number of copies at crossexamine.org. Go to crossexamine.org, click on store. You'll see it there. You can also get some of our other great products while you're on the site. Or you can order it from Amazon and get it after February 4th. Back in 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere. What do you do when culture hates you? Despite the fact that the country, at least in some areas, have moved back to sanity, we don't think the culture is going to suddenly fall in love with Christians. And the brand new book by Natasha Crain will help you be a better disciple when culture hates you. That's the title of the book. And in this segment, we're going to talk about some very practical things you can do. And one of the topics in the book has to do with the difference between social justice and biblical justice. That's a point of confusion for many people, especially ever since the George Floyd riots. That's been front and center in our culture, the difference between social justice and biblical justice. And the folks who are fighting for social justice say they're one and the same. But Natasha, what is the difference between social justice and biblical justice?
So I talk about this in a chapter called Power Hungry Oppressors, because the focus in the book is really on explaining why people hate us. So not just, these are different concepts, social justice and biblical justice, but why do those who hold to an unbiblical view actually hate us? They see us as these power hungry oppressors. So you have to understand their view of justice to see how they get there. Justice, if we just take a basic definition, is about making right that which is wrong. So in order to make right wrong things, you actually have to have some kind of standard in order to determine what is right or wrong in the first place. So for Christians, our objective standard for determining what's right and wrong and what therefore needs to be fixed is going to be God. So we go to the Bible for that because He's the authority, we're not. But secular culture, of course, is not going to use God as their standard for determining what is right and wrong. So anytime you use any standard other than God to say these things are right, these things are wrong, here's what needs to be fixed, you're going to often get it wrong. Sometimes those things will happen to align, like we talked about earlier in this show. Sometimes the world will be using some other standard and it's going to happen to align with what God would say about right and wrong. But oftentimes it doesn't. And so in this case, we get a standard that's based on neo-Marxist ideas. That's what's most prevalent in culture today in terms of the standard being used to determine what's right and wrong based on power dynamics in society. So you have the social binary of saying this group is in power, this group doesn't have the power, and right and wrong is determined in those ways. So an example of where this goes wrong is with so-called reproductive justice. So that's a euphemism for women having the right to choose to have an abortion. Well, from the perspective of secular culture, they're going to look and they're going to say, well, in this case, men have the power in society. They're the oppressors, and women do not have the power in society. They are the oppressed. Men should not be telling women what to do. This is inherently wrong, according to this model. And therefore, we need justice for women. We need to make right that which is wrong, which is women should be able to have control over their bodies. That would be the argument that they would make. So you get to a very wrong idea of justice when you're using the wrong standard of a social binary in that way. In God's economy, right and wrong are not determined by who has power and who doesn't. It's not determined by who happens to hold that view and doesn't. It's rooted in God Himself. So sometimes those in power are going to hold the right views and sometimes they're not, but it's not inherently about who has power.
So when somebody says, I'm for social justice, what questions would you ask them?
What do you mean by social justice? I mean, that is always the question you can go to for pretty much anything today. When somebody uses a term, they're going to use it in a lot of different ways. What do you mean by social justice? How do you determine what things are right and wrong and what needs to be made right? What is your objective your objective standard for doing that? And sometimes people will have no idea what you're talking about because they don't talk in these terms about, is my standard objective or not? But just asking them the basic questions of how do you decide what things are wrong that need to be made right? And hear what they have to say and see where they're coming from. And then you can better respond.
It's interesting that the Bible says, do not show favoritism to the poor or the rich. It says to treat people based on merit, which is a good thing that DEI, at least at the federal level, is going away because it's basically discrimination against certain people when in fact it should be a merit-based situation, not one based on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And interestingly, some companies are now following this lead. And I didn't realize this until recently. I think Charlie Kirk was talking about this, that the entire DEI apparatus in the government was really started by an executive order that Lyndon Johnson put forth almost 60 years ago. It wasn't even a congressional law. It wasn't a law that passed both houses and this president signed it. He just said in the executive branch, we're going to establish this DEI mantra, this DEI way of judging people and hiring people. And of course, it spread to other branches. And Trump just got rid of it because he could. It was an executive order. It wasn't a law. So it's a good thing that we're now going to be treating people based on merit and not by this social justice standard. Now, as I've been mentioning, friends, Natasha in this book has some very practical ways that you can be a better disciple. And in this chapter on power-hungry oppressors, you have several suggestions on how they can be salt and light on this issue. Can you give us a couple of them or two or three of them, Natasha?
Yeah, so in the second half of the book, where I'm tackling these individual issues that are especially urgent for Christians to understand and where culture is especially hostile toward us, I take these 5 issues, and then at the end of each of those chapters, I have 7 actions for the common good. So to give people some ideas to start thinking about. And in the biblical justice versus social justice chapter, I give some ideas around, for example, working against human trafficking. There are a lot of Christian organizations that work against human trafficking. That would be an example of something that is rooted in a biblical definition of justice. There are people who are being sex trafficked all over the world, trafficked in some other ways as well. You can pray for, you can contribute to these organizations, you can get involved in volunteering. There are a lot of ways to contribute in that way. Not everyone is in a position or in a season of life, and I emphasize this in the book, to jump in and go travel across the world to go and save victims of human trafficking. However, there are a lot of ways that you can get involved with your dollars, with even local volunteering, and of course, in praying for people who are involved in this. Another example is supporting gospel rescue missions. So this one is near and dear to my heart because my husband is the president of the Orange County Rescue Mission here in Orange County, California. And gospel rescue missions are basically programs where you can have people who are ready to become self-sufficient. They're ready to get off the streets. They're formerly homeless, and they come into a program like this for 1 to 2 years. And in doing so, they get job training and life skills training, parenting training, if applicable, and they get discipleship. That's why they're called gospel rescue missions, because gospel rescue missions recognize that an important part of your recovery and getting your life back together is to come to know the Lord. And so rescue missions exist in hundreds of different places across the country. I think there are 300 some rescue missions out there, and there are directories online where you can find them. And you can volunteer locally. You can donate. The one that where my husband works, they have a huge warehouse. And so if you just have items that you want to donate, then you can go by and do that. And so there are a lot of ways that you can support organizations that are doing that work, even if you don't have the ability to do the time yourself.
Yeah, you have another suggestion here. This is on page 155. You say, help make it possible for low-income and single-parent families in your church community to choose homeschooling or Christian private schools. I love that idea. I would have never thought of that. I mean, you could probably contribute. You could probably make a fund at your church that says this goes to homeschooling parents to help them buy curricula or help them get the necessary necessary materials they need in order to homeschool their kids. That's a great idea. There's several others in the book, ladies and gentlemen, When Culture Hates You. This is on what are the 5 topics? Let's look at the 5 topics. You just mentioned one of them. After you set it up in part 1, understanding the hate, the second part is responding to and persevering through today's most prominent charges. So you have Christian nationalism. That's one. Then you have power-hungry oppressors. We just talked about that. Controlling misogynists. That has to do with the abortion issue. Then cruel rights deniers. The titles here, ladies and gentlemen, we're cruel rights deniers if we say that kids ought not be transitioned. And then this last one, Natasha, I don't even think we can talk about this on the radio. The last chapter of the book, ladies and gentlemen, is called Hateful Bigots, The View from the Sexual Revolution. If we talked about that chapter here on the American Family Radio Network, I'm not sure AFR would want us to, because it's explicit, it's shocking, most people don't know about it. But maybe you can describe what it is, and we're going to talk about it on the Tuesday podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, you're not going to be able to hear it here on AFR. You've got to find the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. It's going to come out Tuesday, Lord willing, this coming Tuesday. What is that topic about, Natasha? Just give us the topic rather than going into detail.
So the chapter is called Hateful Bigots, The View from the Sexual Revolution. And I think that most Christians are familiar with that term, hateful bigots, because we've often been called that by those in the LGBTQ community who feel that any kind of lack of affirmation or any kind of suggestion that maybe God has a design for gender and sexuality is inherently hateful. I think most Christians have heard that. But in that chapter, I'm very specifically addressing a subject that I have not seen addressed really in any mainstream book for Christians. And it's getting to basically what a subset, and I want to emphasize it's a subset, but a subset of LGBTQ activists are advocating for, that it's not just acceptance of LGBTQ ideas amongst children, but it's actually the sexual liberation of children that they're looking for. They are actually looking to erase any kind of societal boundaries around children not being able to experience sexual pleasure themselves.
We are going to talk about that, not on the American Family Radio Network, but on the next podcast, ladies and gentlemen. It is a chapter in Natasha's book. You're going to want to read it, especially if you're a parent or grandparent. Go to crossexamine.org, click on store. You'll get a copy immediately. It's called When Culture Hates You. It's by my friend Natasha Crain. As I say, I was privileged enough to write the foreword. If you can wait till February 4th, you can get it off Amazon or some other place. But Natasha, first of all, great book, but give our listeners your website too, so people know where that is.
Yeah, it's natashacrain.com, and Crain is spelled Crain.
Fabulous book. Ladies and gentlemen, pick up a copy immediately and join us on Tuesday, where we're going to get into something so shocking we can't broadcast it on radio. So we'll see you there, Lord willing. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.